When I first noticed the photo in my inbox, I didn't think much of it. A blurry shot, probably a promotional image or spam. But then I saw the subject, myself, standing by the fireplace in the living room. Alone, I thought. And yet there was a shadow near me, slightly visible in the dim light. My heart skipped. I clicked to enlarge it. The next photo loaded slowly. It showed me again, sitting on the porch, eyes closed, head tilted toward a shoulder that wasn't mine. I knew that moment. I remembered the warmth, the silence. But I never imagined anyone else had seen it. The subject beside me had been cropped halfway, but I recognized the sleeve. I felt my stomach turn. How long had someone been watching us? I scrolled, trembling fingers barely obeying. The last image wasn't taken from afar. It was placed deliberately on the kitchen counter, an actual print. Not digital. I stared at it, my own face frozen in a moment I had thought was private, sacred in its confusion. And yet, someone else had claimed it. That was the moment I knew, my mistake hadn't just happened. It had been documented. Witnessed. Maybe even orchestrated. I gripped the edge of the table and whispered to myself, what have I done? But before I explain how I got to that moment, before I share with you the truth I've buried so deep, tell me something. Have you ever made a choice so quiet, so seemingly harmless, that it grew into something uncontrollable? If so, let me take you back. Back to the beginning. Because 3 weeks ago, I made a decision that changed everything. The first morning in the house was silent in the way old countryside homes tend to be. There was a dampness in the air, even though the sun streamed generously through the tall windows. I sat at the wooden table with a chipped mug of black tea, watching the steam rise like a ghost above the rim. The radio was off. My phone was silent. My husband's last message had been a simple one, still in Vienna. Might be longer than we thought. I didn't reply. There was something strangely comforting about being alone. But that comfort had worn thin by the time I heard the car pull into the gravel driveway. I looked through the lace curtain. It was him, my husband's nephew. He was supposed to arrive that afternoon, but he was early. I checked the time again. 10:15. Too early to be surprised, too late to send him away. He walked up the steps with a duffel bag and a carton of groceries. I opened the door before he could knock. "You're early," I said, not smiling. He grinned anyway. "I thought I'd bring breakfast." "You still like rye bread and that awful fig jam?" The familiarity startled me more than the gesture itself. I nodded and let him in. He filled the kitchen quickly with the sound of his movements, the crinkling of paper bags, the clink of mugs, the rustle of his jacket as he draped it over the back of a chair. I stood by the counter, unsure what to do with my hands. "I'll only stay 2 or 3 nights," he said, not looking up. "Just wanted to help with the storm repairs." I nodded again. Words felt too large for the moment. The roof had lost some shingles, and the fence near the garden had collapsed under the weight of wind and wet leaves. I could have managed most of it on my own. At least, I believed I could. But it had been my husband's idea to send him. "She'll appreciate the company," he had said, as if I were elderly, or ill. As if loneliness were something to be treated with muscle and youth. We ate breakfast quietly. The only sound was the crackle of the toaster and the dull hum of the fridge. I noticed how tall he looked in the morning light. How broad his shoulders were. He didn't resemble my husband, no, not at all. He was more still, more observing. Where my husband filled space with decisions, his nephew left space open, like an invitation. After we finished, I washed the dishes while he wiped the counters. The kitchen felt smaller than usual. When he brushed past me to reach for a towel, his arm grazed mine. I flinched, not out of shock, but out of something softer. Something more dangerous. "I'll take a look at the roof this afternoon," he said. "If you don't mind." "Of course," I replied, forcing my voice to sound neutral. He headed outside with a toolbox and a ladder. I remained by the window, watching him from behind the curtain. There was something steady in the way he moved, something unhurried. I didn't know why I kept looking. Maybe because I hadn't looked at anyone that way in a long time. Around midday, I made us sandwiches. He came inside, sweaty and dusty, and stood near the open door, letting the breeze in. I handed him a plate. "Thank you," he said. "I forgot how peaceful it is here." I took my own sandwich and sat down. He joined me a moment later. We talked about nothing important, the weather, the repairs, his job. He worked remotely now, in design. He seemed tired but content, in that quiet way people are when they've stopped explaining themselves to the world. That night, after he went to the guest room, I wandered through the house. I turned off lights I didn't need, adjusted cushions, rearranged nothing. I found myself pausing outside his door. The hallway was dark, except for a sliver of light beneath his door. I stood there too long. I told myself I was just making sure everything was fine. I went back to my room and sat on the bed. The sheets felt cold. I hadn't changed them since my husband left 2 weeks ago. I reached for my phone, opened our message thread. The last reply was still there. "Might be longer than we thought." No follow-up. No question about how I was doing. No checking in. I closed the app and locked the phone. Lying in bed, I thought about the morning. About the way the kitchen had felt different, fuller. About the moment when his arm had brushed mine. It had lasted no more than a second. But the memory of it kept returning. I wasn't used to being noticed. Not anymore. And that, I think, was the beginning. Not the photos. Not the moment by the fireplace. But that tiny, wordless flicker of recognition when I realized I missed being seen. I didn't know what to do with that feeling. But I knew it was real. The next morning was quiet in a different way. Not the comfortable solitude of the day before, but something more aware, more alert. As if the house itself had begun to listen. I moved through the kitchen deliberately, making tea, cracking eggs, heating the pan. Every sound echoed louder than it should have. I didn't hear him come in. Only when I turned to reach for the plates did I see him standing in the doorway, barefoot, arms crossed, hair slightly disheveled. He looked like he had just woken up, and maybe he had, but something in his expression was different. Softer. Quieter. "Morning," he said. I nodded, placing the plates on the table. "Breakfast's ready." He sat across from me, rubbing the back of his neck. The silence stretched between us, no longer casual. I reached for the salt, and our hands touched, just briefly, but the contact was enough to send a wave through me. I withdrew quickly, pretending to focus on the eggs. The meal passed in fragments. Small comments. Quick glances. I didn't ask how he'd slept, and he didn't offer it. When he finished, he stood up, collected the plates, and carried them to the sink. I followed him with my eyes, noticing again how natural he looked in the space. As if he'd lived here longer than a day. After breakfast, he returned to the yard to continue fixing the fence. I stayed inside, wiping counters that were already clean, refolding dish towels, organizing shelves that didn't need organizing. I was restless. Distracted. I couldn't stop thinking about that brief contact, the weight of it still lingering on my skin. It wasn't the touch itself that unsettled me, it was the absence of resistance I felt in myself. No alarm, no guilt. Just warmth. And that frightened me more than anything. Later, I brought him lemonade. The sun was sharp, and he was kneeling in the dirt, hammering in the last slat of the fence. His shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat. I stood behind him for a moment, glass in hand, watching the rhythm of his arms. When he turned, surprised by my presence, I held out the glass. He took it, their fingers brushing again. This time, I didn't move away. Neither did he. "Thanks," he said, voice low. "You didn't have to." "I know," I replied, and immediately wished I'd said something else. Or nothing at all. He drank in long swallows, then handed back the empty glass. His eyes held mine a second too long. I turned and walked back inside. The afternoon passed in haze. I tried to read, but the words blurred. Tried to nap, but my mind circled. I changed the sheets in the guest room, opened windows, adjusted curtains. Each movement mechanical, meant to distract from the shift I couldn't name. It was almost evening when the rain began. Not a storm, but a slow, steady drizzle that misted the windows and softened the sky. He came in from the yard, hair damp, clothes sticking to him. I handed him a towel wordlessly. He dried his face, looked at me. There was something in his eyes, uncertainty, perhaps. Or restraint. It mirrored what I felt. I turned away, walked to the window. "Does it always feel this quiet here?" he asked after a pause. I nodded. "Especially when no one talks." He chuckled softly. "Sorry." I shook my head. "It's not your fault. I've gotten used to it." That was the truth, though I hated admitting it. Silence had become my companion. Not peace, just the absence of anything else. He moved closer, but not too close. "Still. It's good being here. With you." I turned toward him, and for a second, we just looked at each other. The moment stretched thin. I felt my pulse in my throat. Then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, we kissed. I don't remember who leaned in first. I don't remember how long it lasted. Only the heat of it, the stunned stillness that followed, and the way I stepped back, breath uneven. He didn't speak. Neither did I. We stood there, in the soft dimness of the living room, with the rain pattering against the windows. Eventually, he nodded once, as if in understanding, and turned to go down the hallway. His door clicked shut. I remained in place for a long time. Then I sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded tightly in my lap. I stared at the fireplace, unlit and cold, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. It didn't feel real. But it was. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every breath loud in the stillness. My mind spun. Not with guilt, not yet, but with confusion. Desire. The terrifying realization that I had crossed a line I never thought I would approach. But I didn't regret it. And that truth unsettled me more than anything else. The next day, I woke early but stayed in bed longer than usual. The sheets were warm, the air cool, and I didn't feel ready to face whatever came after what had happened. I stared at the ceiling, listening for sounds from the rest of the house. Nothing. Just the faint creak of wooden beams settling in the early morning chill. I got up slowly, moving with the hesitation of someone stepping onto thin ice. I didn't know how he would act today. I didn't know how I would. What happened the night before had no name, no label I could wrap around it to feel less exposed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't discussed. But it had happened, and now we existed in a changed atmosphere. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty. A note lay on the counter, scribbled in his quick, slanted handwriting, "Went to get more nails. Back soon." I exhaled quietly. Grateful, maybe. Or simply relieved to have a moment of space. I made coffee and stood at the window, watching the light shift through the trees. The drizzle had passed, leaving the grass damp and the sky pale. Everything looked clean, too clean for the muddle I carried inside me. I sipped my coffee slowly, trying to sort through the threads of thought tangled in my mind. The night before had not been a mistake in the usual sense. It hadn't been reckless, not really. It had been quiet, unspoken, and still wrong. Not legally. Not even morally in a conventional way. But wrong because I had allowed something to stir in me, something I'd spent years keeping quiet. By mid-morning, he returned with supplies. I watched from the doorway as he stepped out of the car, arms full of wooden boards and a bag of tools. His eyes met mine just briefly. No tension. No smile. Just acknowledgement. And maybe that made it harder. We didn't speak about the kiss. We didn't speak much at all. He got back to work, and I busied myself with laundry, folding sheets with mechanical precision, wiping windows that didn't need cleaning. I needed to be moving, needed my hands to stay busy, my mind distracted. But it didn't help. Every time I passed by a window and caught sight of him in the garden, I felt that flicker again, awareness. Not of him, exactly, but of me. Of the way I existed differently around him. Around noon, he came in to wash up. I was at the sink, rinsing vegetables for lunch. He paused in the doorway, hesitated a second, then walked past me to the towel rack. The space between us felt charged, but not volatile. Just full. Like something unsaid hovered in the air, waiting for a gust of wind to push it loose. I turned, drying my hands. I thought I'd make soup, I said, my voice even. He nodded. Sounds good. That was it. No mention of the night before. No questions. No apologies. We ate at the table in near silence, spoons clinking softly against porcelain. I tried not to look at him too much, tried not to let my thoughts slip. But I felt his gaze once, quick, searching, and I knew he hadn't forgotten either. After lunch, he offered to take the compost out back. I watched him from the kitchen window, moving down the path toward the edge of the trees. A moment later, he bent to tie one of his boots, and something caught my eye, a movement at the far corner of the yard, near the old garden shed. I narrowed my eyes. A flash of something. Maybe a bird. Or just the breeze. But it left me uneasy. When he returned, I didn't mention it. Instead, I went upstairs to change the bedding in the guest room. His room. As I pulled off the sheets, I paused. The faint scent of his cologne lingered on the pillowcase, clean, unfamiliar, strangely grounding. I folded the sheets carefully and placed them in the hamper, then opened the window to air out the room. The breeze rushed in, cool and fragrant with earth. I leaned on the windowsill and looked down at the yard. Everything seemed in place, normal. And yet, a restlessness settled over me. Like I was waiting for something without knowing what. Later in the afternoon, he asked if I'd like to go for a walk. I hesitated, then agreed. The path through the woods behind the house was muddy in places, but manageable. We walked slowly, not speaking at first. Just the crunch of leaves beneath our shoes, the distant call of birds, the occasional snap of a twig. Eventually, he broke the silence. I hope I didn't make things uncomfortable, he said, eyes forward. I shook my head. You didn't. We walked a bit further before I added, it's not about comfort. It's about sense. He nodded. And sometimes things don't make sense. I didn't reply. We kept walking. At the edge of the woods, we reached the small lake. The water was still, mirroring the gray sky above. I stood at the bank, arms folded, watching the light shift over the surface. He stayed a few steps behind, giving me space. This place feels outside of time, he said eventually. Like nothing follows you here. That's why I come out, I replied. To forget time. Or pretend to. We lingered for a few minutes, then turned back. The walk home was quiet again, but it wasn't awkward. Just suspended, like a note held too long. As we approached the house, the first drops of rain began to fall. By the time we reached the porch, it was coming down steadily. I reached for the doorknob, but paused. There, on the doormat, lay something unusual, a small piece of paper, folded once, tucked under the edge of the mat. I bent down, picked it up. Nothing written. Just a grainy photograph, black and white. It showed the back of the house, taken from a distance. The image was slightly out of focus, but recognizable. I stared at it, heart beginning to thud. He stepped behind me. What is it? I shook my head quickly and slipped it into my pocket. Probably junk. Someone's idea of art. He didn't press. We went inside, and I made tea to fill the space. My hands were trembling just slightly. I told myself it was from the cold. But I knew it wasn't. I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. Even as I folded towels and cleaned out the spice cabinet and later swept the hallway, the image remained lodged behind my eyes. The back of the house. Taken from somewhere just beyond the edge of the garden. Not artistic, not random. Intentional. I didn't want to dwell on it, but every time I paused, the question circled back: who had taken it? When? And why leave it there, beneath the mat, almost like a warning? No, not a warning, more like a whisper. As if to say, I see you. The day dragged on. I moved from room to room with no purpose other than to be busy. I rearranged bookshelves, wiped the glass on picture frames, repotted a plant that didn't need it. Outside, the rain continued, a steady, unrelenting drizzle that dulled the edges of the world. By late afternoon, I found myself sitting at the dining room table with my second cup of tea gone cold, staring at the trees swaying behind the window. He had gone upstairs after lunch, said something about answering emails, and hadn't come down since. The silence in the house felt different now. Less peaceful. More aware. I pulled the folded photo from my sweater pocket and looked at it again. There was no stamp, no watermark, no handwriting. Just the faint outline of the porch, the railing, the shadow beneath the kitchen window. If it had been taken the day before, or the day before that, I couldn't tell. I considered telling him. Briefly. But what would I say? That someone had been watching? That I might have been careless enough to allow it? It felt absurd. And yet, I slipped the photo into the drawer under the fruit bowl, then closed it gently. In the evening, he came downstairs, freshly showered and back in the same worn sweater he'd arrived in. I was preparing dinner, simple pasta with vegetables, and the smell of garlic and oil filled the kitchen. He offered to help, but I waved him off. We ate without much conversation. The kind of shared quiet that isn't uncomfortable, but thick with undercurrents. I noticed the way his eyes lingered on my hands when I passed him the salad. The way his posture shifted slightly toward me when I leaned forward to refill my glass. None of it overt. Nothing I could call out. But it was there. And I felt it. Afterward, he took his plate to the sink, rinsed it, and stood for a moment, looking out the window over the darkened yard. The porch light cast a weak halo over the wet steps, and beyond that, everything disappeared into blackness. It's strange how empty it gets out here after sunset, he said. I didn't reply. He glanced back at me. Do you ever feel uneasy, being here alone? I shrugged. Sometimes. But it's quieter than the city. Quieter than the noise I'm used to. He nodded, then walked toward the hallway. At the stairs, he paused. I'll be up early tomorrow. I want to finish the fence before it gets worse. I said goodnight, and he disappeared upstairs. I stayed at the table for a long time, staring at the last few sips of wine in my glass. The clink of silverware had long faded, and the kitchen had returned to stillness. But inside, nothing was still. The pressure in my chest hadn't let up since that photo appeared. The idea of being watched gnawed at me, even as I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Just a prank. Or trash. Or a mistake. But I didn't believe that. Later, after cleaning up and locking the doors, I stepped out briefly onto the back porch. The air was cool and wet, the rain now reduced to a mist that clung to my hair and eyelashes. I looked around, at the fence line, the garden, the woods beyond. Everything was still. Too still. I squinted into the darkness, wondering if I would see another flash, another movement. Nothing. Back inside, I closed the door and slid the deadbolt. That night, I lay in bed, unable to rest. Every creak in the house caught my attention. Every gust of wind against the window sounded like a footstep. I rolled onto my side, then onto my back. I counted breaths, minutes, shadows. At some point, I must have drifted into a shallow sleep. When I woke, the room was dim with early dawn. I turned my head toward the window and froze. There were muddy prints on the balcony outside. Just a few. But fresh. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. The prints weren't large, but they weren't mine. They were deliberate. Spaced. Someone had been standing there, just outside the glass, sometime in the night. I got out of bed and stepped closer. The mud was damp, smudged in places. I pressed a hand against the windowpane. Still cold. I didn't scream. I didn't call his name. I just stood there, stunned, caught between fear and disbelief. Then I grabbed a towel and wiped the prints away. Back downstairs, the drawer with the photo was still closed. I didn't open it. When he came down later for breakfast, I acted normal. I smiled. Asked about his sleep. Made coffee. But every moment felt rehearsed, every gesture slightly offbeat. I watched him carefully. Waiting. Wondering if he would say something. If he knew. He didn't. But something in me had shifted. And I knew this wasn't over. The next morning arrived too soon. My body was tired, but my mind had barely let me rest. Even in the fragile fragments of sleep I managed to grasp, I kept returning to the same image, footprints. Not just on the balcony, but moving through the house, pressing softly into rugs, pausing beside the bed. There had been no one, I knew that. But fear isn't about logic, it's about what seeps in through the cracks when you're not watching. He was already outside by the time I came down. Through the kitchen window I saw him hammering the final pieces of the fence into place, moving with focus and steadiness. His back was to me, and for once I was grateful. I wasn't ready to see his eyes. Not yet. I poured a cup of coffee and stood at the counter, hands wrapped around the mug, waiting for it to cool. The silence in the house was different now. Tense. Like it had become aware of the line we crossed. Like it was waiting, too. When he came back inside, his cheeks were flushed from the cold. He took off his gloves and set them on the table without looking at me. "Fence is done," he said. "Thank you," I replied, keeping my voice low. "Neutral." He nodded once and went to the sink to wash his hands. I turned back toward the counter, pretending to check my phone, even though I hadn't charged it overnight. The screen was blank. Just my reflection staring back. "I thought I'd head out tomorrow," he said behind me. "Leave early." I didn't answer immediately. My throat felt thick. All right, I managed. If that's what you want. Another pause. I think it's best. There was no argument in me. No protest. Only a strange, growing stillness. Like something inside had already detached itself and was watching from a distance. He didn't join me for breakfast. Took a cup of coffee to the porch instead. I watched him from the kitchen. He leaned on the railing, staring into the trees, like he was trying to absorb the view, to take it with him. Or maybe forget it. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning again. Not to impress anyone. Not even to distract myself anymore. Just to move. To exist through movement. I vacuumed rugs, scrubbed the stovetop, polished silver that hadn't been touched in months. Each task completed without emotion, as though I were preparing the house for someone else's arrival. Just before lunch, I remembered the laundry. I went out to the shed behind the house where we kept the washer and dryer. The ground was still soft from the rain, and I stepped carefully along the stone path, arms wrapped around myself. Inside the shed, the air was thick and humid from the dryer's heat, and I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. As I sorted through the basket of clean towels, I noticed something on the floor. A corner of a black plastic bag peeking out from under the shelf. I crouched down and pulled it free, expecting trash, maybe old hardware. But what I found stopped me cold. Inside the bag were photographs. Dozens of them. Some in color, some grainy black and white. All of them of the house. The porch. The windows. The garden. The back fence. Taken from a distance. Some during the day, others clearly at night. I dropped the bag and stepped back, heart pounding in my ears. My breathing came fast, shallow, as though the walls were closing in. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been watching. 4 days. Maybe longer. The photos were real. They were here. And someone had hidden them, deliberately. I looked around the shed, suddenly aware of how small and enclosed the space was. There was no camera. No sign of who'd been there last. But the dust had been disturbed. Someone had touched this spot recently. I grabbed the bag and rushed back to the house, locking the door behind me. I set it down on the kitchen table and stared at it, hands shaking. Then I opened the drawer and pulled out the photo from earlier, laid it beside the others. Same style. Same angle. Same intention. But who? I thought of the neighbors, though they lived far enough away not to see into the property. I thought of the man from the hardware store who had delivered supplies a few days before. Polite, unremarkable. I thought of the silence that sometimes seemed too deliberate. And I thought of him. But no. It couldn't be. It made no sense. When he came inside for lunch, I had already hidden the bag in the hall closet. He didn't notice my face. Or maybe he did, but didn't want to ask. We ate in silence again. No more pretending. No more small talk. Just two people waiting for the moment to pass. That afternoon, the rain returned. Heavy, rhythmic, pounding against the windows like a slow, steady drum. I sat in the armchair by the fireplace with a book I didn't read. He sat across the room, eyes on his phone, fingers unmoving. For a long time, we didn't speak. But I could feel the weight between us. Not attraction. Not guilt. Something heavier. Recognition. Then he looked up. We never talked about it, he said. I didn't answer. He continued, maybe that was a mistake. I closed the book slowly, placed it on my lap. What would talking change? I asked. He looked down. Maybe nothing. I nodded, once. Then maybe silence is better. He didn't argue. Just stood, quietly, and walked toward the hallway. I stayed where I was, the sound of rain thick around me. Later that night, I checked the closet. The bag was still there. Untouched. But the hallway light had been left on. And I was sure I had turned it off. The following morning, I woke up feeling heavier than I had in days. Not physically, but as if something invisible was pressing into my chest, anchoring my thoughts into a place I didn't want to visit again. I sat up slowly and stared at the light filtering through the curtains. It was cloudy again, gray and motionless. The kind of morning that didn't offer clarity, only stillness. Downstairs, I moved through the kitchen like a ghost. The kettle whistled faintly. The smell of toast hung in the air, untouched. I poured coffee, but left it to cool on the counter. My eyes kept drifting to the hallway. To the closet. To the bag I hadn't opened again. To the light I was certain I hadn't left on. He didn't come down until almost noon. By then, I had folded laundry, reorganized the pantry, and taken 3 unfinished calls from my husband without answering any of them. I wasn't ready to speak with him. I wasn't sure I had anything to say that wouldn't crack. He appeared at the kitchen entrance, hair slightly damp from the shower, dressed simply, plainly, like any other day. I figured I'd head out after lunch, he said quietly. I nodded. All right. There was no warmth in my voice, but no bitterness either. Just a low current of something neither of us could name. I'll pack in a bit, he added. Again, I nodded. No resistance. No questions. What was there left to discuss? While he ate, I stayed busy wiping down a clean counter, refilling the sugar jar, tightening a screw on a cabinet hinge. He didn't comment on it, didn't ask anything. But once, I caught him watching me, and we both looked away at the same time. After he finished, he rinsed his plate and left it on the drying rack. Then he lingered by the back door for a moment. I'll take one more walk around the garden, he said. Say goodbye to it. I watched him step out, the door closing softly behind him. I stood for a long time after that, the silence in the house now taking on a different texture. Not heavy. Not threatening. But irreversible. Something had shifted between us. No, not just between us, within me. And that was the truth I couldn't look away from anymore. Later, I went upstairs to strip the guest bed. The linens still carried a faint scent, his cologne, his shampoo, his presence. I moved slowly, folding each piece with care, as if preserving some invisible line that still hung between us. When I returned to the closet, I opened it. The bag was still there. But this time, I noticed something new. Tucked beneath the original stack of photographs was a second envelope. Sealed. Cream-colored. No name on it. I pulled it out with careful fingers and held it to the light. Nothing visible through the paper. I didn't open it right away. I took it with me to the kitchen and placed it beside the bowl of fruit, beside the drawer where I had hidden the very first image. It felt like the envelope had weight to it, like it wasn't just paper inside. I stared at it, unsure if I was afraid of what I'd find, or of what I might not. Before I could make a decision, I heard the back door open. He stepped inside with a softness that made me flinch, as if he too felt the difference in the air. Finished walking? I asked, forcing something like calm into my voice. He nodded. Yeah. Just wanted to take one last look. He stepped past me to grab his bag from the corner, began collecting the rest of his things with quiet efficiency. No fanfare. No delay. Just a man packing up to leave a place he wasn't meant to stay. As he zipped up his bag, he looked at me once more. I'm sorry, he said, and this time, it wasn't about the kiss. It wasn't about the silence. It was something deeper. Something we both knew couldn't be named without breaking what remained intact. I nodded. I know. He stepped toward the door, then paused. I hope you'll be okay. I've always been okay, I replied. That seemed to settle something between us. He opened the door and stepped out into the fading light. The gravel crunched under his shoes, and then, slowly, the sound receded. I didn't watch him go. Instead, I turned back to the envelope. I sat at the table, pulled it toward me, and opened it. Inside was a single photograph. This one was different. It was a photo of me, standing in the kitchen, back turned, reaching for a mug on the shelf. The angle was close. Too close. It had been taken from within the house. I dropped the photo on the table and stared at it. I didn't remember anyone being there. I didn't remember anyone even visiting recently. And yet, the photo existed. And someone had taken it. Not from the garden. From inside. I stood abruptly, heart hammering. I went to the front door. Locked. Then the windows. All locked. I walked from room to room, checking closets, under the beds, even the cellar door. Nothing. No sign of forced entry. No missing items. No trace. And yet, someone had been inside. I returned to the kitchen and stared at the photo again. Was it him? Could it have been? I didn't want to believe that. Not after the quiet. Not after the stillness. But the photo didn't lie. Unless it was old. Unless someone else had taken it. Someone I hadn't thought about. My husband? No. But maybe. I stared at the photo until the lines blurred. Outside, the sky was darkening. And I felt, for the first time since all this began, completely alone. Not just in the house, but in the knowledge that I no longer knew who had been watching. Or when. Or why. The next 24 hours unfolded with a quiet eeriness, like the house itself was holding its breath. I went through the motions of daily life, boiling water, feeding the birds, watering the plants in the window, but nothing felt real. Each task was a shadow of routine, lacking meaning, lacking weight. I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the corner of the table where the last photograph lay face down beneath a placemat. I didn't dare turn it over again. That evening, I finally returned my husband's call. His voice was distant, not just because of the weak reception, but in tone too. He spoke like a man balancing too many things at once, each sentence cut short by half interest. He said he might be home by the weekend. I didn't ask if he missed me. I didn't say anything that might sound like need. He wouldn't hear it. After the call, I sat in the living room, staring at the cold fireplace, remembering how we used to build small fires during our early years here. He would arrange the logs, I would light the match, and we'd drink wine while watching the flames curl and pop. Now, there were no flames. Just echoes. The silence between us had grown so slowly over the years that it no longer surprised me. What surprised me more was that I had grown used to it. Night came quickly, heavy with wind and the promise of more rain. I shut the curtains early, double-checked the locks on every door and window, then carried my tea upstairs to the bedroom. But I couldn't sleep. My body was tired, but my mind wouldn't quiet. Every noise, every creak in the old house made me sit upright in bed. I thought again about the footprints on the balcony. About the photograph taken from inside. About the envelope. About the bag in the closet. A storm had started to form in my chest, and I couldn't keep it from spreading. It wasn't until nearly 3 a.m. that I drifted into sleep. The kind that doesn't refresh but only resets the clock. I woke again at 6, tangled in the blankets, my skin clammy with sweat. I spent the morning in a daze. I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't check my phone. I just moved from room to room, unable to settle, unable to be still. I took a long walk down the gravel road behind the house, my boots crunching over stones as I tried to outpace the thoughts chasing me. When I returned, a car was parked in the driveway. My heart jumped. But it was only the delivery man. A small white van, engine running. He waved when he saw me and handed me a narrow cardboard box. "No signature needed," he said, turning to go. I called after him. "Who sent it?" But he was already back in the van. I stood on the porch for a moment, box in hand, the breeze biting at my arms. The package was unmarked. No name. No return address. Just a plain label with my own written in block letters. I carried it inside with fingers that shook. I opened it at the kitchen table with a butter knife. Inside was a second envelope. Thicker than the last. And a note. Folded once. I picked up the note first. It was handwritten in small, cramped script. "You think this is all about you. But it's not. You weren't the only one being watched." I read it again. Then a third time. My fingers tingled with cold, even though the room was warm. I opened the envelope next. More photographs. Not just of me this time. Him. Walking through the garden. Standing in the living room. Staring out the window. Sitting at the porch steps with a cigarette I never saw him smoke. In one of them, he's looking directly into the lens. It wasn't just me. Someone had been watching him too. I leaned back in my chair, stunned. The edges of the photographs curled slightly on the table, their surfaces catching the light. I couldn't understand it. If someone had access to both of us, then this went deeper than I'd imagined. It wasn't just chance. It wasn't coincidence. Whoever had taken these had been deliberate. Had planned it. Had known where we'd be. When we'd be alone. Had chosen moments where we were most unaware. Most unguarded. I thought about the hallway light being left on. The photo taken from inside the house. The placement of the first envelope. None of it was accidental. I packed the photos back into the envelope and placed them in the drawer beneath the fruit bowl, now crowded with pieces of evidence I didn't know what to do with. My hands trembled as I pushed the drawer shut. That afternoon, I sat by the window for hours, watching the empty driveway, the road beyond, the edge of the woods. I wanted to see someone. I wanted to catch a glimpse of whoever had done this. But there was no one. By nightfall, I'd moved the bag of photos from the hallway closet to the attic. It was the only place that still felt untouched, though I no longer trusted any corner of the house. Before going to bed, I found myself standing at the top of the stairs, looking down into the darkness below. The floorboards groaned softly beneath my feet, but everything else was still. I imagined someone standing there in the shadows, watching me, waiting for me to go back into my room. But there was nothing. I turned off the light and returned to bed. I didn't sleep. The next morning arrived dull and gray again, a repetition of the same overcast tone that had marked each day since he left. I moved through the house with a kind of mechanical grace, completing the motions of breakfast without really tasting anything. My thoughts kept circling the drawer, the attic, the photos, especially the last delivery, the note. Asterisk, you think this is all about you. But it's not. You weren't the only one being watched, asterisk. That sentence lodged in my brain like a splinter, the kind you can't see but can't stop feeling either. I had spent days thinking everything was a reflection of my actions, my mistake, my guilt. Now, it wasn't just me. He had been part of it. Maybe even more than I knew. Maybe more than he knew. I walked through the rooms slowly, checking the windows out of habit. Nothing had changed. The same trees, the same fence, the same gravel road disappearing around the bend. But I felt watched even in the stillness, as if the air itself remembered things I didn't. After lunch, I took the envelope back out and spread the photographs across the dining table. One by one, I examined them again, this time looking for details I hadn't noticed before. Most were taken from angles that could have been reached from the woods or the far corners of the yard. But three were different. One was through the side window, partially obscured by the lace curtain. He was inside, pouring a glass of water at the sink. The reflection of the room behind him was faint but visible, no one else in the frame. The second was through the living room window, the camera catching him from behind as he stared into the fireplace. The light from the fire hadn't been on. I remembered that moment. I'd been upstairs, folding towels. But the third made my breath catch. It was taken from the guest room doorway. The angle was unmistakable. He was sitting on the bed, elbows on knees, looking down at the floor, unaware. And the only way to get that photo was from inside the house. I sat down slowly, trying to calm my pulse. The photograph shook faintly in my hand. This wasn't just about surveillance. Someone had been in here, in the house, when we were unaware. Maybe even when we were sleeping. The thought chilled me more than any cold night wind could. I stood and locked all the doors again, even the ones I already knew were locked. I checked the windows, latches firm, no cracks. I pulled down the attic ladder and climbed up, retrieving the black bag of earlier photos. Then I placed everything on the table together. The full scope of it. The entire timeline, spread before me like puzzle pieces I was too tired to assemble. For hours, I sat there. Around 4 in the afternoon, I heard a car approach. I rose quickly, heart suddenly in my throat, and looked through the front window. The sound grew louder, tires crunching over gravel. Then it stopped. A familiar car. My husband's. I hadn't expected him until the weekend. I stepped back from the window. My fingers were damp. My legs felt unsteady. The door opened a moment later, and he entered with his usual presence, firm steps, distracted eyes, a leather bag in one hand and his phone in the other. "Hey," he said, setting the bag down near the coat rack. "You're quiet. I didn't know you were coming today. Meetings got cancelled." He looked around. "Place smells like lemon oil." I cleaned. He glanced at the table, where I had hurriedly covered the photographs with a linen cloth. He didn't ask what was underneath. Didn't seem to notice anything was off. He looked tired. Maybe that helped. We talked a little, nothing important. He told me about a hotel that lost his booking, about a train delay. I nodded, responded in short sentences, and watched him carefully. Eventually, he asked where the pliers were. Said he wanted to fix the door to the back shed. I told him they were in the utility drawer. When he left the room, I pulled the photographs off the table and placed them back in the drawer, then tucked the envelope deep behind the cookbooks. I wasn't ready to ask him what I needed to. I wasn't ready to hear his answer. That evening, he cooked dinner. I helped, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know what else to do. The routine of it made things feel almost normal, except for the way his voice didn't quite match his expressions, the way he kept glancing at his phone even when it didn't ring. After we ate, he said he was tired and went to bed early. I sat on the couch alone, the television muted, my thoughts too loud. I tried to recall every moment from the past week that might explain what was happening. Every detail. Every shift. Every look. I thought of the missing minutes between tasks, the unexplained footsteps, the hallway light, the envelopes. The possibility that someone close, too close, had orchestrated it. At midnight, I checked the drawer again. Everything was still there. But the folded note, the one that came with the second envelope, was gone. Not moved. Gone. I stood there for what felt like minutes, the drawer open, my hand hovering just above the space where the folded note had been. I remembered its weight. Its texture. The sharp corners of the paper. It hadn't been just in my mind. I had unfolded it, read it, reread it. And now it was gone. Vanished as if it had never existed. The photographs were untouched. Still stacked in the same envelope. Still arranged in the same order. Only the note was missing. That singular piece of writing, the line that had shaken me more than anything else. You weren't the only one being watched. I closed the drawer slowly, my fingertips tingling. My breathing shallow. I turned and glanced down the hallway. The house was dark. The kitchen light was the only one on. My husband had gone to bed an hour ago. I had heard him close the door. I had heard the mattress creak. Had I forgotten where I left the note? No. I had placed it between the cookbook and the drawer liner. I remembered the motion exactly. It was deliberate. Careful. And now it was gone. I walked back into the living room, my mind churning. The silence in the house felt heavier than usual. It was no longer peaceful, no longer even neutral, it had taken on a new kind of presence. A presence that listened. I sat on the couch and tried to think. To piece it all together. The photos. The deliveries. The message. The footprints. The hallway light. The sound of the balcony door one night that I'd dismissed as wind. And now, this. Had someone come back into the house? Or had someone never left? I stood up again and checked all the locks for a third time. Front door. Back door. Kitchen window. Bathroom latch. All sealed. All unchanged. I returned to the living room, turned on one dim lamp in the corner, and sat at the table with the envelope. I didn't remove the photos again. I just stared at the flap. At the edge of silence that folded itself around me. I thought about waking him. Asking if he had seen the note. If he had taken it. But what would I say? How could I frame the question without opening the door to everything else? There was no neutral way to ask if your husband had found evidence you'd hidden from him. No soft way to approach the idea that he might have been watching. That he might have known. Maybe from the beginning. The thought frightened me, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't the fear of being exposed anymore. It was the fear that I'd been a piece in something I didn't understand. That this house, our house, had become a place where secrets didn't just grow quietly in corners, but were harvested, catalogued, and returned in envelopes. At some point I must have fallen asleep at the table, head resting on my arms. When I woke, the lamp was still on, the room was cold, and the house was still. But I wasn't alone. Footsteps. Not loud. Not hurried. Just soft enough to question whether I had truly heard them. I rose slowly, ears straining. Nothing followed. The hallway was dark. The staircase silent. I walked to the window and looked outside. The driveway was empty. No strange cars. No figures in the yard. No movement near the trees. And yet, the feeling remained. In the morning, my husband acted as if nothing had happened. He poured coffee. Asked if I'd slept well. Made a passing remark about needing to fix the light bulb in the shed. I nodded, answered softly, watched his hands as he stirred sugar into his mug. He didn't mention the envelope. Didn't mention the drawer. Didn't mention the missing note. I waited. Listened. Studied his expressions. There was no sign. No signal. But I no longer trusted the absence of signs. That afternoon, I opened my laptop to check email. I hadn't done so in days. I clicked through work notices, subscription offers, a reminder from the pharmacy. But one email stopped me cold. No sender listed. No subject line. Just a small, square icon, an attachment. I didn't open it. I stared at it for several minutes, heart thudding. I hovered over the download button. Then closed the laptop without touching it. I stood and moved through the house again, each room quieter than the last. I climbed the attic stairs. Checked the black bag again. Still untouched. I looked around at the insulation, the beams, the small windows layered with dust. Nothing moved. Nothing shifted. But I felt it again. That sensation I couldn't name. The one that had started on the day we kissed. That moment when something invisible split open. Not between us, but inside me. When I allowed the silence to wrap around me not as protection, but as escape. Downstairs, the house felt colder. I walked back to the kitchen and stood in front of the drawer. My fingers hovered again. Then I turned away. Some things didn't need to be rechecked. As I passed the hallway, I noticed the guest room door ajar. Not wide. Just barely. Enough to see the edge of the bed, the curve of the pillow. He had left days ago. I had changed the sheets. I knew I had closed that door. I walked toward it slowly. Gently placed my hand against the wood and pushed it fully open. Nothing inside. No mess. No clues. But the room smelled different. Faintly. Like his cologne. Or something close enough to it. I stood there, just inside the doorway, and listened. The house didn't speak. But I no longer believed in its silence. The decision to leave didn't come in a moment of panic. It came in silence, like most of my decisions did now, without drama, without emotion, just a quiet shift in the air, a recognition that something had run its course and continuing to stay would only deepen the hollow. I woke early that morning, before the sun lifted itself above the hills, and lay there listening to the house. Not for noises this time. Not for secrets. Just to the stillness. My husband was still asleep. His breathing low and steady, a rhythm I'd memorized over the years but no longer found comfort in. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, hands resting in my lap, staring at the grain in the wooden floorboards. The light from the hallway stretched across the rug like a warning I chose not to heed. I packed lightly. One bag. A few clothes. A notebook. My charger. The envelope of photographs. Not all of them. Just a few. I didn't need the whole archive to remember what had happened. In the kitchen, I wrote a note. Simple. Brief. Not a confrontation, not an explanation. Just a leaving behind. I didn't say where I was going. I wasn't sure myself. I only knew I had to get out of the house before I became part of its walls. By the time I stepped out onto the porch, the sky was beginning to shift into its softer blue. The air was sharp, early autumn cool. I stood for a moment, bag over my shoulder, and looked back at the house. The windows reflected nothing but the growing light. The roof still needed repairs. The garden had overgrown again. It looked peaceful. But I no longer believed that look. At the bottom of the driveway, I waited for the taxi I had ordered the night before. I didn't check my phone. I didn't scroll. I simply stood still, bag at my feet, and watched the mist lift from the grass. When the car arrived, the driver didn't speak much. I gave him an address near the station and leaned my head against the window, watching the trees blur past. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel relief. Only something like clarity, and knowing that this chapter had closed itself long before I admitted it out loud. At the station, I bought a one-way ticket. Not out of symbolism, but practicality. I didn't want a return date set. I didn't want to measure my time by days spent away from the house. I chose a seat by the window on the train and took out the envelope. I didn't open it. I just held it in my lap, feeling its edges press against my skin. The few photographs I had brought with me were enough. The one of me in the kitchen. The one of him in the yard. The one of us on the porch, cropped to show only shoulders and distance. They weren't proof of anything. They were simply reminders. A few stops into the journey, I noticed someone had left a newspaper on the adjacent seat. I reached for it without thinking, flipping it open to the middle pages. And there, among the classifieds, was a handwritten note scribbled in the margin. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It wasn't signed. It said, simply, "You're not done yet." I stared at it for a long time. The ink was faded, the paper creased. Maybe it had been written weeks ago. Maybe months. Maybe it had nothing to do with me. But the words settled in my chest like a stone. I folded the paper, slid it between the pages of my notebook, and turned back to the window. Outside, the world rolled past. Fields, wires, sky. I didn't look back. I didn't try to understand who had written the note or why it had found its way to me. I only knew one thing. Whatever had started in that house, between the silence, the glances, the mistakes, and the photographs, it had changed me. And some changes couldn't be undone. Only carried.